Okay, shall we start? So this is the first meeting of the new academic year. So welcome to the new academic year. It's also a special occasion because it's the annual awarding of the ARNOLD PFEFFER Prize, which in the new, young, emerging field of neuropsychoanalysis is undoubtedly the most prestigious prize in that field. Previous winners of the prize, now here's my brain. Eric Kandel, I won the prize. Jaak Panksepp, Stephen Swomey, Laura Volkow, Howard Chevron, Antonio Damasio, how many is that? 7. Did I say Helen Mayberg? Helen Mayberg. All the big muckers have won this prize. And today another big mucker is winning it. And I'll tell you something about him in a moment. When I got married, my father-in-law was terrified that, because I'm not Jewish and my wife is Jewish, and my father-in-law was a big deal businessman, and he was terrified about what I was going to say at this wedding in front of all of his business colleagues. And you don't know with the Goyim what they're going to do. So the day before the wedding, he said to me, "So tell me, Mark, what are you going to say at the wedding? What you're going to say in your speech?" And the truth is, I was so freaked out by the whole occasion, I hadn't yet got to writing a speech. So he said, "You should tell lots of jokes." I said, "At these formal occasions, it's all that these idiots understand is jokes." So that became the basis of my speech. I told them my father-in-law was very anxious about what I'm going to say to all of you, but he said that all that you idiots will understand. So since this is a formal occasion, I'm going to tell you some jokes. Actually, this is not a joke, it's true. The prize that we're giving to Georg Northoff today is the 2010 ARNOLD PFEFFER Prize, and even though it is October 2011, this is the stately pace of the New York Psychoanalytic Institute. There was a famous psychoanalyst, Bruno Bettelheim, who's reputed to have said, "Don't just do something, stand there," as a sort of properly psychoanalytical advice. So we didn't do something, we didn't just do something, we stood there and waited for it to emerge from the unconscious who should win the prize for last year. And this is not unusual, it's always like this, Georg. In case you think that there was any special cogitation in your case, it wasn't. We always give the prize at least 18 months late. So it's like that joke, in fact I'm sure you all know this joke, so I'll be quick. It's where a very elderly 90-year-old couple go to the divorce lawyers and say they want to get divorced. And the lawyer says, "But you're 90, why are you getting divorced now?" And they said, "Well, it's about the children. We had to think of the children. We had to wait for them to die." Now, must I make this announcement now before I tell them about Georg? I think so. Okay, Maggie Zellner, who sits over here, said I have to make this announcement before I get into the formalities. Next month, on Thursday, November the 3rd, we are having a benefit to try and separate you from your money. And you have to come. And it's at 7 p.m. at the Red Rooster in Harlem. Yeah. We're having a benefit in Harlem, I swear, at the Red Rooster restaurant, which is a phenomenon. I don't know if you need a foreigner to tell you about that. It's a phenomenon in your own backyard. It's between 125th and 126th Street. It's on Lenox Avenue. which is the extension of Malcolm X Boulevard, and I've been there, even though I'm white. A white South African has been there, so it's safe. But it's brilliant. It's an unbelievably brilliant place. They've got this sort of celebrity chef, what's his name, Marcus Samuelson, and it is actually a very moving thing to experience. You know, I mean, for me as a South African to say this here is a bit ridiculous, but such a divided society as this city is, to see a restaurant like that, it's just fantastic. It's absolutely wonderful, and the food is brilliant, mostly sort of Cajun stuff. And our special guest is Charlie Rose, who's nearly as famous as Georg Northoff, who I'm about to tell you about. Georg Northoff is kind of a little bit of everything. My daughter, who's now 11, when she was 7, somebody asked her what she's going to be when she grows up. And she said, this is true, she said, I'm going to be a brain person, of course, and a wine person, of course, and a fashion person, and a rock star. And that's, Georg Northoff's also sort of a few things and a rock star. He's had a fairly meteoric rise and appearance on this scene of our field. He's an MD von Deutschland aus, ursprünglich, but now he lives in Canada, in Ottawa, where he has an endowed chair in neuroimaging and neuroethics and psychiatry and a few other things, and is the director of something there. And he's also got a Canadian research chair of something or other, you know, like my daughter's, all these sort of layers and layers and layers of things. He's a physician, he's a psychiatrist, he's a brain imager, neuroscientist, and a philosopher. I mean, a proper philosopher. He has an MD, a PhD, and another PhD. And in Germany, when you're a professor, you know, here you don't even say professor, you say doctor to everyone. But in Germany, if you're a professor, they say professor if you're a full professor. They say professor doctor, you know, because of course you have to be a doctor before you become a professor. So they say Herr Professor Dr. Georg Vogel. I mean, in this case, Georg Northoff and entschuldigen Sie. But in his case, they have to say Herr Professor Dr. Georg Northoff. So I'm delighted to tell you that the winner of the prize this year is Herr Professor Dr. Georg Northoff, the philosopher, neuroscientist, brain imager, psychiatrist, and rock star. He is really a rock star because he's recently done some performance pieces and written mystery novels about trying to find the self in the brain and, you know, this sort of stuff. He's seriously a weird guy. But very nice, and most importantly, he's very clever. We used to give this prize for a particular work that had basically contributed to a coming together of psychoanalytical and neuroscientific ways of seeing the mind. But then we gradually realized that the people who we were giving the prize to, it was a kind of artifice to say that it was for a particular work. So it's really become more of a matter of recognizing a body of work that has done, moved mountains, moved Muhammad's or mountains, or both of them a little bit, in our attempt to forge this unholy alliance between psychoanalysis and the neurosciences. If we have to identify one particular work of Georg Northoff, then it would be this one. I know you can't see it from there, it's hopeless. But just please note, it's a book cover in which there's a person with no head. So if you see a book with no head on somebody's shoulders, that's the one you want. The title is Neuropsychoanalysis in Practice, and it's published by Oxford University Press. And the author is Herr Professor Dr. Georg Northoff. Ah, there's the book. There's the book. Here's the mystery novel. Die Fahndung nach dem Ich. He's German, and you'll see he's really German, properly German. From the heimische, fruchtbare Gebilden of Magdeburg, which is where he was a full professor before they cut him. What is cup in English? Snatched him away to Canada. It really is a very great pleasure we were thrilled. You know, mostly the people who come into this field are kind of motley crew, sort of malcontents or abandoned children and so on, people who couldn't find their scientific or intellectual home anywhere. So to have somebody with such a pedigree as Georg Northoff bestow his mind on our field has really been a great pleasure for us. Even though he hasn't solved absolutely everything about the meaning of life yet, he's very, very, very nearly there. So this is not our normal proceedings. Normally I would discuss the lecture, but this is an award lecture, so there's no discussant. But Georg has very kindly said he's happy for us to take questions after the lecture. So I'll run around with the microphone and take your questions, and I have a sneaking suspicion I might have some questions of my own that I will slip in unfairly during the proceedings. So have I said everything? Benefit, Red Rooster, Professor Dr. Northoff, very clever, and that he's getting this medal and lots of money. With this medal comes lots of money. So before his lecture he's got to come up so I can give him a medal and lots of money, and we can take a picture. This is old ARNOLD, after whom the center is named. You remember him. You can tell you don't need to train in psychoanalysis at all. You just look at somebody's face and you can see if they're a good mensch or not. ARNOLD, he had this open, clear, lovely face behind which lay a soul just like that. And here it is, immortalized. Lots of money. Congratulations, Georg, and we're looking forward to your brilliant lecture.
Thank you very much, Mark, and I'm very moved. Thank you very much for coming and acknowledging. And I'm very happy that sort of the kind of jumps back and forth and moving between different disciplines. I need to be, can I run around? Can I do it like this? Okay, okay. So I like to move because I can only think if I move. That's the way my brain functions. Okay, yeah, so thank you very much. I'm very honored and I'm very happy that this kind of transdisciplinary work I'm doing is acknowledged, because Mark already indicated this. Everybody cries for interdisciplinary work. When you actually do it, you often get bashed from the interdisciplinary people. I'm sure psychoanalysis has a long history of that, so I'm very happy about this. Why do I do neuropsychoanalysis? Because I'm interested in the brain. Because I do think that neuropsychoanalysis and psychoanalysis can teach us a lot about the brain. So you might wonder, why not the other way around? Usually you think neuroscience can complement psychoanalysis, of course, but also the other way around. And that's basically the very backbone of my talk, and I hope I can give you some indication of how that works. So, when psychoanalysis thinks about the brain, it's just gruesome. You don't want to deal with it. Arthur Schopenhauer, famous German philosopher in the 19th century, called it just a grey, pulpy mass. And you see what I made out of it, a grey, gruesome grey pulp. So this is basically, it's just an object, it's just mere grey matter. Nowadays it's a little bit more colorful with the functional images people from the fMRI you get, but still, we don't want to deal with it. Why? Because it's just gray matter and as such does not contain any traces of our life meaning of subjectivity. The basic sense of subjectivity, of consciousness, of a sense of self, of meaning, and all these kinds of things. So the question is the brain, and if we want to link neuroscience and psychoanalysis, we might also have to think about what kind of concept of the brain we presuppose. But don't worry, it will not become very theoretical. The question is, how can we practice this? And you see that the practice of neuropsychoanalysis, and I will give you, my main talk is about applications to clinical cases of personality disorders. But let me just preempt 2 slides about the methodology. That's very important, because for me, practical issues, the practice and theoretical issues go hand in hand. Otherwise, the practice without the concepts remain blind, and the concept without the practice remain empty. So, if you're versatile in philosophy, you see that I adapted a famous quote by Kant, the German philosopher. So, what does this mean in terms of methodology? This is the usual way. It is often, I should not be in the way here, maybe I should walk over here. Is there some? I don't have anything, it's fine. Okay, anyway, it's on it. So, what you usually think, okay, you can deduce everything just from the brain, and then you can basically map, and that's basically a reductive eliminative approach. You just try to reduce your psychoanalytic concepts and try to map them one-to-one onto the functions of the brain. Then there are the opponents of neuropsychoanalysis, which I'm sure you know very well. They say the semantic dimension, the meaning, the subjective dimension cannot be found within the brain, and that's now the most important point, it is principally impossible to link the 2 domains, the domains of meaning and the domain of observation. So then you end up in a parallel.
It's the button furthest away from you. It's the one you want. That's it.
And this is sort of what I try to do. It's a bilateral model. And as I said, it's not only that psychoanalysis can learn from neuroscience, but also that neuroscience can learn from psychoanalysis. Why? Because psychoanalysis deals with subjectivity. And ultimately, we have to see how the subjectivity is generated and yielded by the brain. Yeah? So I turn to psychoanalysis and get some ideas what I have to study in the brain. So this is basically a bilateral model, science of the brain, the hermeneutics of the mind, and try to link the 2. So this is all nice in theory, but how do you practice it? So this is a sort of a brief outline. I don't want to go into detail about this, but what is for me important, we start with the psychodynamic concept, which usually taps into something personal and subjective. And I think the great vision of Freud for me was that he tried to preserve the subjective and the personal dimension while putting it into objective concepts. I think that's for me one of the great contributions of Freud, the vision. That's what I can learn. Because if we want to link it to the brain, we have to do exactly that. And you will see, yeah. So, but then the psychodynamic concept often describes this meaning dimension, and it's usually qualitative. When you have a neuroscientific concept, it needs to be quantified. You need to measure it. And you measure only in quantifiable terms, but not qualities. So there you encounter a basic problem, how to translate the meaning dimension of this into the observable dimension that can be quantified as a neuroscientific concept, which ultimately is impersonal and objective. But, and this step is crucial, and I do think that you cannot just map one-to-one. There's a whole issue in philosophy of translation. Philosopher Quine, whom all the reductionists usually cite, said you cannot translate one-to-one, which would argue against the reductive. So, and you will see, I will give you an example how I try to do the steps. This is very crucial, because if you lose the personal subjective here, you're out of it. You're out of it. So this is a very important step. And in my group, we discuss this step continuously. It's the same if you use phenomenal concepts like consciousness, free will, intentionality, stuff. So we have a lot of conceptual discussion. Then you have to do the neuroscientific concept, then you have to design an experiment, which is appropriate, and then you have to do neuroscientific facts. This is basically easy. And then the difficult step comes again, because then many people stop here and say, this is just the fact. But what you really want, oh, this is nice with the bottles here, I really like this. I think it doesn't appear that well. Okay, so this is important. You have to feedback. So what do your data imply for the meaning of the concepts? So you really want to sort of feedback. So then maybe you have to modify your psychodynamic concept to make it empirically plausible. And then you generate a new meaning dimension. So, and that's of course, this may sound very strange to some classical psychoanalysts. So they may be very confused when they read my book. I start with the psychodynamic concept. Obviously, I cannot go through all the details of the psychodynamic literature, because then I would need to write a psychodynamic. Yeah? So then I do the neuroscientific facts and do all that, and then I feedback, and then at the end I discuss the implication, and then I suddenly do something which is very unusual. I shift the meaning of the psychodynamic concept. And then I start again. That leads to new concepts. So this is why I call this concept, fact, iterativity. It's not circular, it's iterative. Yeah? It's constantly improving, matching, comparing empirical data, conceptual meaning, really in a bilateral way. Okay, sounds all very abstract, nice on paper, nice on the slide. Now I will try to give you an example. And then you can see how much or how less I live up to my own feelings. Okay, so today, I did a lot of research about the self, but today I want to go the opposite direction. I want to go to the object, the concept of the object. And as I said, please don't expect a detailed psychodynamic account of all the meanings and definitions of the concept of object. So I leave out many authors, and many authors might feel left out when they read my book, but you have to consider, you have to streamline. Yeah? Otherwise, you cannot deal with everything. So, how does the brain process and signify what we as observers call objects? So, you just read and say, okay, now it's about object. But there's already one central thing here. I say what we as observers, as outside observers, call objects. So this means an object is not an intrinsic property as such. It is something which we describe as object by use of our concept. Whether that is reality is the second question. Yeah? Because we may not be able to fully see the reality. It's actually a very crucial point also for Freud, who had a very Kantian epistemology for the philosophical background. And Dr. Northoff also has a very Kantian epistemology on the brain. But I don't want to go into that, I want to go into the practice. So, and I focus on one particular aspect, on object and affect, emotion. So this is, again, very limited. This is a price you have to pay if you want to do neuropsychoanalysis. You have to be very specific and can only cover a very, very small segment of one particular concept. When I read the psychoanalytic literature, you usually have a big concept which covers a lot of ground. That makes it very general, which is very nice, but also very abstract and very remote for possible empirical testing. So you have to pin down things. When you read my book, Each chapter is basically just one little aspect. And many other aspects are left out. When I discuss introjection, projection, it's just one particular aspect of it. So please do not expect a full coverage. But what instead I can offer is a specific linkage with neuroscientific mechanisms. So this is what I try to do here in my talk about object. So I presuppose, Otto Kernberg described it very nicely, external perception is linked to the perception of primitive affect states representing drive derivatives. I focus on this, not on this, on the affect state. So, and of course you can have cases where basically your objects are hijacked by the affect. Consider, for instance, borderline patients, which will become a major topic of my talk. So I will go into that. And on the neuroscientific side, of course, affect, you all know this, Georg Northoff, subcortical regions are prime. You have particular circuits down there which mediate evolutionary ingrained emotions affect. So meaning these are certain predispositions hardwired in the brain which let us always react in certain ways if they are the appropriate stimuli from the outside. So this is very important. You already see I sketched the brain-environment interaction. And I call this sort of, it's the way I used it in my book, and also the object-affect structure. Affect hijacks the cortical and subcortical neural process, subcortical there, neural processing of internal and external objects on the basis of predisposition in the brain. So there's a lot in that. First, I say the brain only provides a predisposition. It's not a neural correlate. And this is essential. I am so angry about all these neurons, and you see my anger here. I display it right away. Neural correlate, Christoph Koch consciousness means sufficient conditions of consciousness. But what we really want to know, and there's always a gap. When you see the current series of consciousness, when you see neuropsychiatry, there's always a gap, because that's what you really want to know is not that. You want to know how it is possible that a neuronal state can get transformed into a mental state. So why the hell do I perceive you instead of the firing of my neurons in the brain? I have no chance of not perceiving you. Sorry about saying that. But I could also just imagine, perceive the firing of my neurons. Then I would not perceive you. And how is this transformation possible? There must be a predisposition in the brain itself. And that's exactly the crucial thing. I think that's what Freud also tried to figure out in his 1895 writing. Yeah? With the terms of his time. So this is why very important. So that also means I do not locate objects in the brain. I say there are certain mechanisms in the brain which yield something which we as external observers describe as object when we consider it in relation to the environment. So there you already have the seeds of a non-reductive approach. Yeah? This is very important. So the details, I know this is very fine-grained and sticky, but it's very important. And you see I already make a distinction here between internal and external objects. You can have objects internal from your memories, or also your own body can become an object, as we all know, and I will demonstrate it in the further due of my talk, and also external objects. We all know this very well. So basically, what I say, in the relation between brain and object, affect is a central mediator. Without affect, we couldn't make this transition. Affect is always there. I mean, this is really what Georg Northoff can tell us, and what he also taught me. Affect is a necessary condition of the transition. It's always there. You cannot experience objects themselves without accompanying affect. Okay, so how can we now investigate this? Just very briefly, affective emotion, there's a long, big discussion, there's a big topic in current neuroscience. It's often considered in a very cognitive way. This is what Kevin Oxner and other people doing, cognitive regulation, cortical, subcortical down, top-down modulation. But this is not what Georg Northoff means, and that is also not the kind of affect you need to consider in psychoanalytic terms, particularly if you're interested in the generation of object and sense of self. So it's a very basic dimension if you want to speak of raw affects. And now I want to take the example of personality disorders as examples of different possible relationships between object and affects. I will present you data from borderline personality disorder, somatoform disorder, and narcissistic personality disorder. And we applied very basic paradigms in functional imaging like reward and empathy. I will show you the details. And these may be central in constituting the kind of unstable objects you see in personality disorders. I will specify that in the further detail of my talk. So I'm still in the conceptual phase. I try to map the psychodynamic conceptual ground, the neuropsychodynamic ground, and you see I take affect and emotion as a key to open the door behind which I think there could be the objects. Yeah? So now the different personality disorders. Again, I cannot go into detail, just focus on one particular aspect. Everyone who has seen borderline personality patients knows that they have highly volatile affects and that the objects can change dramatically within seconds. Yeah? And this has often been described that the objects are abnormally hijacked by their emotions and affect. They're very impulsive, explosive. From one second to another, they can just turn, the affect changes, and the object changes. Yeah? That makes it so really difficult. Then somatoform disorders. Oh, my body hurts, and this and that, and here, when I talk, my lower jaw, yeah, everything hurts. All my affects are projected on my lower, oh God, no, I don't want, I have to stop talking, sorry. This is what you get from somatoform patients. Yeah? And so there seems to be a shift from external objects to internal objects. The own body becomes the predominant object to which the affect is attributed and assigned. Affect is no longer assigned to external events, external objects. The body is basically the placeholder of all the affects, and everything is projected upon the body, and which is perceived in an extremely fine-grained and hypersensitive way. And then you have the narcissism. I know I will get a little bit into the concept of narcissism later. There, you have often affective emptiness. So in the interpersonal contact, they're very cold, very withdrawn, there's no affective resonance, and sort of, I call it affective emptiness of external objects. So now I want to present you imaging studies which go into this. So I mapped the ground, the relationship between objects and affects, roughly in the first preliminary stance. And now I show you some imaging data where we investigated various facets of affect in these disorders, and then I make some inferences from those data about the concept of object in the disorders and the concept of object in general. So I then try to close my loop. Okay, so starting with personality disorders. One central dimension is value, reward. Everybody wants to be rewarded. I'm very happy to be rewarded with a prize today, and it turns on my reward system, my value system, which is in subcortical regions of the brain, ventral striatum, nucleus accumbens, and ventral tegmental area. I will show you some slides in the next slides here. So what do you want to do? So you want to try how there is an interaction between this reward system and affects and emotion. Of course, you all say, when I get the medal, it generates a positive effect. Sure, and it certainly does. But also, if there's a certain rewarding event, at the same time there's some emotion going. So you're always in a certain mood, certain affect, and then an event comes to reward. And we wanted to investigate how that impacts the reward. So because the reward creates a value, what we ultimately call with the outcome is an object. So now we want to see how emotions interact with the value dimension, ultimately object. So what we did a typical reward task for the specialist, the monetary incentive delay task, where you sort of had to anticipate, you had to gamble for money. It was back in Europe, in Germany, and it was at the time when the euro was still worth a lot. So people had to anticipate, and you know nothing is better and stronger a signal than if you anticipate, wow, tomorrow I get the 1 million. Even if you don't get it, but the anticipation is already so great, it gives you a kick. Yeah? So there you are, so this is basically what we did. And then of course you receive feedback whether you won or lose, so you have to sort of bet. And what we then did, prior to the anticipation period, we included positive and negative emotions. So this is a very favorite slide of my doctor student, Björn Nancy, who did this, and it made the round in my group. Yeah? This little nice animal, and I'm sure it induces positive emotions. Almost, I hope so, everybody. Yeah? So it always puts you a little smile on your face, and see how that affects. So what we could investigate here, we could investigate the reward system, as well as the emotion system, as well as how the interactions. So here you have a valuing of a certain stimulus, which the outcome might psychodynamically be described as an object. And you can see how the perception of emotions interacts. So this is really, I think, a good paradigm for affect-object interaction, if you want to say so. And it also taps into exactly those regions. Jagd always turns out the subcortical region. You will see it before. So we investigated that in borderline healthy subjects as well as borderline patients. Here is just a typical, I don't want to go into detail that for the specialist. So this is a typical, just the reward effects. You see the typical subcortical regions, ventral striatum, PAG, inferior superior colliculus, tectum, VTA, substantia nigra. Here you see the whole subcortical gang, if you want to say so, ventral striatum, very typical. So you see, when you anticipate that you win $1 million tomorrow, that's what will happen to your brain. So this is complete, this is nothing new. This is basically just a confirmation. And now we want to see how these regions' activity during valuing of stimuli is modulated by emotions. How that is abnormal in borderline patients. So, again, you don't need to go into the details of this. I just try to first, what we investigate here, you see there's a typical reward region here, also perigenial until cingulate. You see there's not a major difference. This is just the reward. This is just the anticipation of reward. You don't see a major difference. There's some slight difference, but not a major difference. Then you see here all the signal changes for the emotions, as well as the reward, the interaction signals. And keep your focus on this. Here you see what we call in imaging a good deactivation. Whatever this deactivation is, we don't know currently in exact physiological details, but what this deactivation is, at least is a change in activity. Describe it like this. So something happens in the brain's resting state, it somehow changes, it is modulated. And sometimes change is always good. Yeah? Because change can be adaptive to the changing circumstances in the environment. So here the healthy subjects, they have a lot of change when they see, particularly when they have the interaction between, for instance, negative and positive, negative emotions, emotional picture, as well as reward. Here's the same for the positive. You see there's a lot of change. Then you see the borderline patients, there's not much change. They're not able to properly deactivate. But their reward system is relatively normal. You can see it here. But as soon as emotions come into play, their reward system gets abnormal. It gets hijacked. It cannot move anymore. It cannot properly adapt. Here you see a lot of modulation. Here you don't. And that's interesting. It's not that there is overall no deactivation, because for reward they are able to properly deactivate. But as soon as emotions come into play, they're unable to deactivate, to change. And I think this nicely maps what you see in clinical reality. They can be completely normal, and as soon as affective emotions come into play, they get impulsive and get crazy. Yeah? I think this is a very nice description, mapping the clinical phenomenology onto what happened. So it's really this, in this case, and this I think it's a good term, that the affect hijacks the reward system. Yeah? So this is basically the description here. You see the same for the other region. Again, don't want to go into detail here. You see here's a nice deactivation. You don't see much deactivation here. So the reward system without emotions is completely normal. Yeah? So basically the reward system itself is normal, but then it gets hijacked by the emotions. Yeah? So by yourself, you are completely normal. But if you then some other extreme circumstances happen, then you get hijacked. Here also applies to the subcortical regions, the ventral striatum. You see a very nice deactivation in the healthy subjects. And you barely see any deactivation in the patients. They're not able to properly modulate their activity when it comes to emotions. The reward system itself is normal, but emotions, they get crazy, literally. And it even goes down to the VTA, midbrain, VTA, ventral tegmental area, substantia nigra. You see very nice deactivation in the healthy subjects. You see considerably reduced deactivation in the patient during the interaction emotion reward. So that tells you that already the subcortical region, I'm sure Jaak would be very interested in that, get hijacked. Yeah, another region, so I think now it's enough. So, brief summary of the borderline patient's finding: hijacking of a relatively normal reward system by emotions. Whether it's positive or negative doesn't matter, because it showed it for both. That's very interesting. Yeah? And that means it leads to unstable value attribution. Of course, if you don't know, does it interact, is it now positive or negative, it's completely hijacked by the emotions. So of course, all your value is sort of tainted and confounded by your emotions. Yeah? It's like a mask you have on your face, everything is dark, or extreme positive, or extreme dark. You cannot dissociate the value and the reward from your emotions. Everything is completely tainted. It's always, emotions are always there in the background. But in the borderline patients, they're always in the foreground. Yeah? It's not that you can make a distinction, this is an emotion, and this is my value. We can do this. They're not able, because it's completely hijacked, this system. So this is basically what I already said. And of course, for me as a neuroscientist now, this question, where does it come from? So why is it that they react so abnormally to emotions, but not to reward? So there must be some property in their brain's intrinsic activity, in their resting state, which makes them particularly susceptible to emotions. Of course, we don't know this property at this point. Yeah. That points to a question, what I call rest-stimulus interaction. What makes the resting state particularly susceptible to emotions? and how is this abnormal borderline personality. And that, of course, then also confounds their sense of self, but I don't want to go into that. That points to that, and here you see, you get, from the consideration of object-affect structures in borderline personality ideas, then also new ideas for neuroscience. So for the healthy brain, I would like now to investigate the interaction between resting state and emotions. And we have one paper published on that and other papers coming out on this. So there you get, out of the psychoanalytic starting point, also a neuroscientific new idea, which probably otherwise you wouldn't get. And that also tells you, because as Georg would probably say, that affected emotions are so strongly ingrained in the resting state. That's what I would extend him in that, say there must be a particular predisposition in the resting state to be intrinsically affective emotionally, because there's always a mood. Your dreams are always accompanied by a mood. When you mind wander, you have thought, intent thought, there's always an affective component in it. When you, trust me, I'm a philosopher, so now what I'm talking about. When you philosophize, there's always a strong emotions in the background. Musicians can tell you when they compose, there's always a strong emotions. You cannot escape emotions, and your mood, it's always there. You cannot do without. If you don't feel your mood, you become depressed and want to die. You want to die. Yeah. Okay. So now, going back from the resting state, now I go to the body. I told you another. So we saw affect and object, how the affect can hijack the value system and ultimately the object's involvement. Now I want to show you another mechanism in the context of object and affect. So here you see somatoform disorder. I think is really when you see these patients, everything is shifted from the external objects to the internal object. Everything is experienced in terms of the body. All the affects and emotions, which might originally be assigned to an external object, are now experienced through the own body. So it's the own body that becomes basically the placeholder for the emotion and the affect. So what happens here? So, and the dimension of affect, there's not much research on the somatoform disorder. And so the first thing you really want to see whether this sort of abnormal focus on the body has something to do with abnormal emotions. So you want to make that point. In borderline it was easy because everybody knows. It's clinically there. In somatoform you have to establish it. So what we did is a psychological investigation, and we included the Toronto alexithymia scale. Alexithymia, the difficulty of access and experience your own emotions. Yeah, you have no access, you cannot experience, you have no feelings. Yeah, and no surprise, the acute somatoform patients before psychotherapy had increased alexithymia score, which is well compatible with clinical reality. And they also showed increased depression. Here it's a back depression inventory. Yeah, and this is after somatoform, after patients after psychotherapy. It was a psychodynamic psychotherapy we did here, which focused on accessing the own emotions. So this is after, and you see a considerable reduction of the alexithymia and a considerable reduction of the depression, and these are obviously the healthy subjects. And also, just as a side note, you see the somatization index in the SCL90 is significantly increased. Of course, that's why they are somatoform. So, what are we doing now with these patients in imaging? So, we did here a reward task. So, we wanted to see how do they value and generate what we call external, how do they value stimuli, which in turn might yield external objects. And you see again, sort of, it's a slightly modified version of the monetary incentive delay task. Again, the anticipation period Here you can see this again, and then you can either win or lose. The punishment, of course, you lose some money, and here you win some money. So this is basically what happens in the stock market. Yeah. So then I show you some pictures, and of course, what is surprising, you have the first thing you probably see in these pictures, you don't see these typical reward system regions. You don't see the ventral tegmental area, you don't see the ventral striatum. All these regions, to our own surprise, did not differ between somatoform patients and healthy subjects. So this was really a surprise for us. We thought there must be something, because there is so much focus on their own body that they neglect the external object. So there must be a deficit in the value attribution and reward. But it wasn't. So you see also we had other tests for reward, psychological, completely normal, the reward system. But, and this is interesting, what you see is the regions which differ between the healthy subjects and the somatoform patients is, and this is a reward paradigm. Yeah? So this is a pure reward, classical reward paradigm. But the regions differing are mainly sensory regions. Sensory regions which process external sensory stimuli. So here you see the somatosensory cortex, postcentral gyrus. See, during reward, the procedure, during the anticipation of reward. So you see in the healthy subject is a good activity. In the acute somatoform patients, you don't see any activity. And after psychotherapy, the psychotherapy was very successful, you see a much improvement. So it seems to be that there's no proper activation in the somatosensory cortex during reward. The same in other regions, this is sort of the dorsal mid-cingulate, which has strong connections to the sensory as well as motor system again. You see the reduction in the acute patient. Even more interesting, the occipital cortex. Yeah? This is close to B1 for the specialists. So even in visual cortex, when they have reward tasks, they do not properly activate the visual cortex and the somatosensory cortex. Another region, the posterior thalamus, which is very closely related to the visual system. This is close to the it's not close to the pulvinar, but it's a posterior, ventral posterior thalamus, which has close connection to the visual system again. So you see, and this is interesting in these patients, you see during reward a deficit in regions which process external sensory stimuli. The somatosensory cortex, the visual cortex, and the thalamus. So the reward system itself is abnormal. But this time, the stimuli themselves apparently are not able to properly activate the external sensory cortex. So the value attribution functions. But the stimuli themselves, the external stimuli, are not properly processed. So there is value attribution going on, but the stimulus is not properly processed. So what does it do? It has no longer the external stimulus available, the value. So all the value goes where? To the internal stimuli. And those are from the body. So there you have a shift. So this is why you then, of course, so the value is there, it needs to be attributed somewhere, and also the emotions. And that goes all then to the internal stimuli. So there's an internal, external disbalance, if you want to say so. And it's a shift. So the question is, here it's again another question, why is the activity in the brain not susceptible or sensitive enough to external stimuli in these patients? So what happens? So in this case we are interested in somatosensory regions, sensory cortex, and apparently their activity is not properly enhanced when you have the respective stimuli in these patients. So something must happen in these regions' activity. So, and then of course, the question is, what is this underlying structure? So you remember we came back to the brain's resting state in the context of borderline the subcortical regions not being sensitive or oversensitive to affect. Now we have the sensory regions not being sensitive enough to stimuli. So there must be something in these regions, activity, intrinsic activity, which is called these days resting state activity, which makes them less sensitive. And this is what I call neuronal predisposition. And among the many questions this raises also this question, if you want to call, there must be maybe some underlying structure within the brain itself, an intrinsic structure in the brain. And this structure, it becomes more and more clear that that may be somehow related to the self, which sort of, as we all know from our daily experience, has its fingers everywhere, but we never encounter it directly, only indirectly. Yeah? I think this is a domain where you can only go into metaphorical, into literature, where you can much better describe these kinds of experience. But you have to somehow link them to mechanisms in the brain. Future directions. So how is this possible? Disbalance in the neural processing of different stimuli, internal, external, in this somatosensory patients, affective valued, affective and reward. So one of the questions I'm really interested in, there you go, I really go to the neural predisposition. How is it possible that something is yielded, which we call object, and that we are able to distinguish it from the brain? So how is this possible? There must be a predisposition in the brain itself that makes this transformation necessary. Yeah? It's a necessary condition of the possibility of transforming neuronal activity in certain regions of the brain in conjunction with the environment into what we as psychoanalysts, as outside observers, call object. So this is of course a very Kantian view on the brain. As you can see, it's a necessary condition of the possibility of the transformation of the brain's activity into what we call object. And what we currently often, when you see in neuroscience, we just try to map the object onto the brain. But nobody comes from the brain and sees the mechanism, how those mechanisms yield what we then call objects. Maybe just for thought experiments, that's why I like the ventures into literature and dialogues and plays. Maybe the brain would smile if it could observe us while we do all this about it, yeah? And of course I could already imagine having a play where one of the participants is a brain. Yeah. So, and of course the other sense is also in the other way. Why do we have a sense of self? You sit here. You may be bored and say, oh God, hopefully he stops in a couple of minutes. You have to endure 10 more minutes. But you have a sense of self. You don't have a sense of your molecules. You don't have a sense of your frontal lobe. You don't have a sense of your dopamine. You don't have a sense of your transmitters. You don't have a sense of your networks. The regions networks are all the same. Yeah? Forget it. I'm not interested. I'm interested in, I have a sense of self. So how is it possible that the brain is participating in generating, in interaction with the environment? In this transformation. And you cannot get at that transformation when you map. When you come and just say one-to-one mapping, okay, this is that. No, it's no way. You have to come from the brain and see how it is possible, what the brain provides, and how that then translates into what we call by mental terms. So this is why I'm really, this is my favorite, how is it come that there's a brain self-differentiation? And this is the question I think you can ideally ask in the context of psychoanalysis. Because you deal with the question of self-object differentiation. Yeah? This is a current theme throughout the history of neuropsychoanalysis. And of course, in everybody, then you have two camps, the object camp, the British camp, you have the self camps, and then you have schools and so on. Yeah? But what I'm really interested in, how is it possible that we can differentiate? Because before you can talk about object, they must be differentiated from the self, and vice versa. So I'm interested in what happens prior to what we often take for granted. Yeah? Again, Kantian twist, I'm sure that Freud would have endorsed that, the necessary condition of the possibility of an object. for that it must be differentiated from the self. And so this is the psychoanalytical. So this is sort of, if you want to say so, let me just, in my wildest dream, a transcendental approach on psychoanalysis. But now I extend this, because I am interested in this one here. I hope that there is one. Yeah? In how is it possible that we can speak of a self as distinguished from the brain, or also as distinguished from our body? Yeah? So, I know that the history of philosophy invented the term mind, but I'm interested, how is it possible that, what does the brain do, contribute, that it differentiates itself, or what we call self, from the brain? So the brain self-differentiation. And that, of course, taps into a very basic question, into the intrinsic activity of the brain and the neural coding of the brain. And I don't want to bother you with that. Okay, so that really comes very basic, and that's where you can learn a lot from psychoanalysis, because you have very nice mechanisms for self and object and how they differentiate. And, yeah, and I'm a big fan of the early defense mechanisms, introjection, projection. Because these are not only defense mechanisms, these are also constitutive mechanisms in certain parts of your life. And there must the differentiation happen from the brain to the self, between self and object, between self, brain and self, and brain and object. So this is why when I got that, I hope it's an insight, I'm not sure, but when I got that idea, it could provide a key. So this is basically my chapters 5 and 6 in the book, which for me provided really a key. And that provides you a whole new view also on the kind of neuroscience you need to do. And it also puts your psychoanalytic concept in a wider context. Last example, and then I finish, the narcissism. I know it's a long, long history of the concept of narcissism. So, I know, and let me be sort of try to the easy escape route, so I don't go into all those concepts here, but I just take it here as an operational way, as a dimensional personality trait with a continuum between normal and pathological. So what we did here in this study is we investigated a healthy subject sample, which was all the students back in Magdeburg, and we subdivided it to 34 subjects, and we applied the narcissism inventory, which is a well-validated scale. I will show you the subscales in the next slides. In German, it's very closely to the NPI, Narcissistic Personality Inventory. And then we divided the scores. All subjects larger than 66 percentiles were high narcissism, and all low, 33% lower than the total score was the low narcissism, and according to the NI. And then, again, we established the link to emotions. It is clinically, if you really have a narcissistic person, they might have sort of a superfluous effect, but ultimately they remain emotionally very cold, and there's not much resonance in the interpersonal relationships. So what you want to investigate in these subjects is empathy, affective resonance, emotional resonance. So this is exactly what we did. So first, as I said, we established the psychology of the emotions. We again did the alexithymia scale, the Toronto alexithymia scale. We did an empathy test, interpersonal reactivity index. We did the BDI, back depression inventory, SCL, symptom checklist. And as I said, neuronally, we did an fMRI. During the empathy perception with subsequent rating, I show you the paradigm in a couple of slides. So these are the psychological results. I know it's a busy slide, sorry for that, but just here, that you really believe me here, these are the subdimension of the narcissism inventory. You see the low narcissism and the high narcissism, considerable differences in the different scores. The higher are much higher. Then, also, which is always nice if you confirm it, in a psychological sense, you have the alexithymia scale, low narcissism, relatively low, high narcissism showed much higher alexithymia. So this is a nice confirmation that what you see clinically, that they have no access to their own emotions. And this is a healthy sample. This is not even pathological narcissism, which clinically you see very rare because these people don't want to see a psychiatrist. And so you see this. So this is an interesting. Then the surprise in the empathy, the interpersonal reactivity index. There's no difference between high and low narcissism. But you have to be aware that this interpersonal reactivity index is very cognitively oriented. It doesn't really tap into the basic affective resonance damage. And then, of course, the depression score, also no surprise, you know that people with high degrees of narcissism tend to be depressed. And this is considerably different here also in the BDI, back depression inventory scale, and also the SCL90, the global score, and particularly the somatic score also high. So this is basically a nice confirmation of what you see clinically, and this is a healthy sample already. So you have changes in affect alexithymia as manifest in the tacit Toronto scale as well as in the back depression inventory. So now we did an empathy task where you had to see this person and other persons from the Ekman series, phase series. So you saw it just pure perception, 2000 milliseconds. Then there was this brief fixation cross, and then you had to rate the degree of empathy. So how high or low you feel emphatic with this person. And of course you had different faces, smiling faces, angry faces, and everything. So it's quite a variety. And this was very important because we wanted to distinguish the pure perception period from the judgment period. Because the judgment includes some cognitive factors, and that's cortical regions, and those hijacks your subcortical regions. And we really want to separate the two. It's very important to distinguish task-related effects. So, and this is what you see. I focus on one particular region which distinguishes between high versus low narcissism, and it's the right anterior inferior. What you can see here, so we compared the emphatic empathy phases which they judged as emphatic versus non-emphatic phases where they didn't experience any empathy. And then we compared the two groups, high versus low narcissism. Again, be aware this is just a healthy sample. This is a subdivision within a healthy sample, which only differed basically in affective and narcissistic dimensions, not in other ways. So you see here, here you see the spots, the right anterior insula, and interestingly again, you encounter this phenomenon of deactivation. So here they cannot properly deactivate the high narcissist in the non-empathy condition. The low narcissism can deactivate much better. Then you might say, there's so many confounding factors, like face processing. Maybe they just process the face differently. So we excluded, looked for face processing and no difference. Then even more important, are there any differences in the emotions? So maybe it's not empathy, but it's emotion. Then we compared emotional versus neutral stimuli. We also included neutral phases. And there was no difference between the two groups. So that means it must really be an empathy and affective sharing deficit rather than an emotional deficit, primary emotional deficit. Then we also included some general evaluation and also rewarding effects. Maybe it's less rewarding for the high narcissist to emphasize with another person. No, there was no difference. It's particularly viable because the insula is also involved in reward. And then we also had a nice correlation, which is quite nice. You see the degree of narcissism, and you see the degree of activity change. And you can see the lower your narcissism, the higher your narcissism, the lower your activity change. So this is exactly what goes with this one here. You see in the low narcissism more deactivation. This is basically confirmed in this correlation. what do these results tell us about narcissism? So these patients seem to have problems in yielding affective emotions, which is manifest in the psychological scores of alexithymia, depression, somatic symptoms. The right anterior insula is the key region in linking interoception and emotions. There's a strong convergence between intero and exoceptive stimuli. So the hypothesis based on these findings is maybe these patients do not have access to their own emotions, because they do not have, they may have changes in interoceptive processing. So they cannot properly link internal interoceptive signal and exoceptive signal, bodily stimuli and external environmental stimuli. So what do? I don't experience emotions, but of course you want to experience emotions. You want to feel something. This is all life is about. You want to feel. The moment you don't feel anymore, you want to kill yourself. So what do? If you cannot properly feel emotions in relation to external objects, and to internal objects, as the somatoform patients do, you take your own self as an object and constantly focus more on yourself to generate emotions. And this is our working hypothesis for these patients. So they cannot apparently properly link intero and exoceptive stimuli to yield emotions in the context of other people, as we showed in the empathy paradigm, of other objects. So they take their own self as an object, as a last sort of try to yield some emotions. So they shift all their focus from the external object, from the body, to their own self. So their own self, and then they desperately come into this loop. And I think many of the pathologies we see are due to these compensatory strategies, which is hidden deficit behind. Okay, let me summarize and then I come to the end. I showed you in borderline personality that the objects, the value to reward, are sort of hijacked by the emotions and affect. And that there seems to be a confusion, as I call it, affect-object confusion. The object is confused with the affect. Both cannot be properly distinguished anymore. They're completely identical, they fuse together, and then of course, their behavior is completely logical. Yeah? So they're overwhelmed by the affect. And I said it's the interaction of the emotions, one central system, the reward system. Then I showed you the somatoform response. So there's another thing. So there seems to be an abnormal shift from external to internal / bodily object. There seems to be a confusion between environmental objects and bodily objects. And we assume that the sensory systems, including the somatosensory cortex, may be central systems. Because there's decreased activity, and then you shift all your affect to your interoceptive / bodily stimuli. So the brain, in a way, reacts very logically, but we are not logical. We don't understand it. So then you have narcissism, and you have this abnormal. So this is too much here. Abnormal affective emptiness of the object, and what I would call maybe you have sort of an object self-confusion. You cannot properly attribute and assign affect to external or even internal objects, the own body, or environmental objects. So then you try to generate and yield some affect, and if you cannot manage to do this with internal or external objects, then you try to do this with self. And our hypothesis is that the insula and also the self system, the cortical midline structures, may be central. So what do these results tell us about objects? So now you see, you remember my initial loop. Now I went through all the experimental data. Now I feed back to the concept of objects. I try to sort of make some neuropsychodynamic specifications, as I would call it. So now I basically try to generate a notion of object which is empirically / neuronally plausible, in accordance with the empirical and clinical data. Yeah? And I think that is something which also Freud tried to do. That's why he went into all these clinical cases, and he tried to establish empirically plausible objective psychodynamic concept that properly describe the subjective and personal elements in mental states in an empirically and clinically plausible way. So there is no way, all these examples tell us, there's always affect and emotions. Always. You cannot escape it. And we have it in all extremes. One extreme where we almost lack affect and emotions, where there's a feeling that you can't feel anymore, is in depression. The opposite is also the case. If you have too much of emotions, as for instance in borderline, in hijacking, yeah? Or mania is only positive emotions, you're all just positive emotions. Yeah? They don't have objects anymore, ultimately they're just manic excitement. Yeah? They lose their objects too. So this tells you, it's already Kant said, everything which is too less is bad, and everything which is too much is also bad. We need the middle. Yeah, this is really important. We need the balance. That's what our brain tells us. Yeah. So this is why I designed the term object, affect, structure. Object is clear, affect is structure, and structure is important. So you see in my findings there are different forms of relationship. And all those forms balances. And these balances describe a structure at the node point where neuronal activity is transformed into psychological/mental states. Yeah? This is why it's talk of structure. I think the term structure is very important, but that's where we can again learn from Freud. Because what my aim is to describe the structure of the brain, the neuronal structure, organization. I know this is a completely strange approach to the brain, when you say you certainly don't talk in regions of network, but you talk in terms of structure and organization. But that's my reading of the 1895 writing, where he really tried to get into the dynamic processes and mechanisms of the brain and established the desperate try to yield something what he on the psychological level later described as structure and organization. And I think we need to do the same with the brain. And I'm working on these, and then you suddenly see that the term structure, concept of organization applied to the brain also points beyond the brain to the environment. So you probably ultimately have to assume an environment-brain structure, not brain-environment structure, environment-brain structure. But I don't want to bore you with that. So back to the realities, different ways of, and this is important. We have different ways of yielding affect in relation to object. Georg Northoff would certainly subscribe to the next sentence I'm saying. The brain is an old, evolutionary, relatively old organ, so it developed different strategies and different possibilities. So that means if we talk about object and affect, we need to specify. We cannot use the most general and broad term of affect, but we need to object, but we need to pin it down. And what you see in the personality disorders which I described you, the symptoms we see, from my viewpoint, are compensatory strategies. So the narcissistic patient does not feel any emotions related to external objects. So he tries to generate emotions by focusing on his own self. The borderline patient feels completely swept over by the emotions. So what does he do? He goes to the opposite extreme, tries to shut himself down. Consequence, he feels empty and worthless. Yeah? A core symptom of borderline. But in order to understand these symptoms, you don't have to, again, I know I come always back to this, you don't have to map them. You have to see what happens prior to the symptoms. Yeah? The mechanisms, the processes. Yeah? And we have the somatoform patients. They're not able to properly process external stimuli in their sensory cortices, apparently. And so, but they still want to experience emotions affect, so then it is shifted to what is still somehow functioning, their interoceptive system, their body symptoms, their bodily stimuli. So then you have to shift from external to internal. So, and I said, as I already mentioned before, so this comes, when you understand these personality disorders, it comes psychodynamically to the question of self-object differentiation. You have abnormal self-object differentiation. And I just focus on the object. I didn't even focus on the self. Yeah? But this will be another 2-hour lecture, which for another occurrence. But from the neuroscience point, this yields this question, the brain-object differentiation. And I showed you different parts, internal, external object, affect, external object, objects, and self in the narcissism. So you're completely different stuff. How you deal with the affect in that context. And you see your affect really provides the template for everything else. Yeah, no doubt. And these are, as I said, really new questions, at least from my point of view, brain self and brain object differentiation. So I hope that I could somehow show you a little bit what I mean by concept-fact iterativity. Sort of trying to close, trying to start with the psychodynamic concept of objects. Remember, I just considered in the concept of affect already a very small segment of the concept of object. Then I showed you various clinical disorders from basically going through this. And then basically they showed me that even the object affect structure, which is only just a small segment of the psychodynamic concept of object, needs to be differentiated because there are different mechanisms and ways how object is linked to affect or not linked to affect, or false positively or false negatively linked to affect. And so there you see, and what comes out, that you really have a specification of the concept of affect and of the concept of object affect structure. And that's what I mean is a neuropsychodynamic concept, an empirically plausible or neuronally plausible psychodynamic concept. So I think psychoanalysis, now I turn the other way around, that psychoanalysis can get a lot of inspirations. In the same way Freud went into the clinic, looked at his patients, what can he learn from these patients for the mechanisms in normal, in healthy subjects. The same way, I say, now psychoanalysts can learn something from the neuroscientific findings, how to specify and make its own concepts more empirically plausible. So without losing the inherent subjectivity. Yeah? Good. And in the way I described it for neuroscience and anthropology here, I think there can be a very, very happy marriage, and I think we all see it, between neuroscience and psychoanalysis, and you may say this is a little bit too late, but I think the really difficult thing is the practice, and we need more established theoretical models, this and also the theoretical background. Consider Freud. He worked on the theoretical level, the metapsychological level, the clinical level, the healthy level. Yeah? And I think that's exactly, he was really a transdisciplinary entrepreneur, if you want to say so. And I think that's exactly what we need. And I extend this, current neuroscience needs exactly this. Consider physics at the beginning of the 20th century. It came to limits where it had to go to philosophy, Niels Bohr. And then it got some ideas from the philosophy. And I think that's slant exactly what we need also for neuroscience and psychoanalysis, and then you can have a good practice, happy practice. Thank you very much.